He laughed, just once, but it was enough to echo throughout the meeting room. The dry sound of that laugh, mixed with the clinking of crystal glasses, was the moment Jacob Harris understood. It wasn't just contempt, it was the beginning of a downfall foretold. Houston, Texas, a city where oil creates empires and pride destroys them. Jacob, a retired engineer, watched his son-in-law Ethan Cole, an arrogant young businessman with a $15 million fortune, turn a lifetime's work into a spectacle. If stories like this hook you, you'll want to hear how this one ends, says the narrator's calm voice. Like the video, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications, because this story begins with a laugh and ends with silence. Ethan Cole emerged as the kind of man Houston adores: expensive suit, Swiss watch, and a sharp smile. He inherited connections, not character. In a few years, he transformed a small energy business into a $15 million empire. He called it vision. Jacob called it haste. The marriage to Olivia, Jacob's only daughter, was more of an investment than love. The ceremony took place under golden chandeliers and empty promises. Ethan shook hands with politicians and investors, while Jacob silently watched his son-in-law become the center of a world he never wanted to belong to. The Cole mansion in River Oaks looked like it came straight out of a magazine. Marble staircases, an infinity pool, and cars that cost more than Jacob's old house. Everyone called Ethan a genius. He believed it, and the more they praised him, the further he strayed from the simplicity his father-in-law championed. Jacob, a man with hands marked by work, appeared at the couple's parties like a discreet shadow, always in a brown suit and with a serene gaze. Ethan would jokingly introduce him to the guests as the old man who started it all. Laughter would follow. Jacob would smile back, but the silence concealed years of wounded wisdom. In the local newspapers, Ethan was called the Oil Prince. The media adored his audacity. He bought bankrupt companies and resold them for millions. But deep down, every decision was driven by a morbid need to prove he was bigger than the man who taught him to calculate risks. Even in retirement, Jacob continued to visit the old drilling sites. He touched the hot Texas soil as if praying. "The earth speaks, if you know how to listen," he would say. Ethan scoffed at these phrases. For him, the only sound that mattered was the sound of figures entering the account. At a family dinner, Ethan raised his glass and announced a new multi-million-dollar merger. "It's the future, Dad," he said with a cheeky grin. Jacob responded only with a steady look. The sound of clink, the clinking of glasses, sounded like an omen. That night, the old man understood. The boy was digging his own grave. While Houston shone brightly outside, the coal empire grew like a castle made of wind. Contracts, shareholders, and inflated promises. Jacob tried to warn him, but Ethan wouldn't listen to anyone, and when pride blocks your ears, the first sound lost is reason. Ethan believed he could control everything, the market, the press, and even the people around him. He hired advisors only to hear him agree with himself. Deep down, each meeting was a reflection of his own ego, and the more power he gained, the further he became from reality. The coal energy empire was growing too fast. In just 1 year, Ethan opened branches in Dallas, Austin, and Denver. Headlines called him a visionary, but within the company's glass walls, the numbers didn't add up. Small discrepancies surfaced in reports that no one dared question. Olivia, his wife, began to notice her husband's absence at dinners. He lived surrounded by lawyers, secretaries, and contracts. The love that once seemed solid had turned into a silent agreement. Ethan said he did everything for the future of the family, but the only legacy that grew was fear. Jacob watched from afar, patiently. He had seen empires crumble before. He knew that haste is the enemy of true profit. Once, While visiting his son-in-law's office, he noticed something that unsettled him, a locked room where only Ethan entered. No one knew what was inside. The employees whispered about it. They said that documents related to a secret merger with foreign investors were kept there. Jacob pretended not to hear, but that doubt began to hammer in his mind like a broken clock. Something was being hidden, and it wasn't just money. One night, Jacob found Olivia crying on the balcony. She tried to hide it, but the tears betrayed the weight of a marriage that was losing its meaning. "He's changed, Dad," she said, her voice trembling. Jacob simply replied, "The brightest gold is the one that fades first." The phrase hung in the air like a prophecy. Meanwhile, Ethan was planning an international expansion. He had the penthouse renovated, bought a private jet, and demanded a new armored safe in the office. The password? A combination not even Olivia knew. It was the perfect symbol of what he had become, a man locked inside his own ambition. In meetings, his tone of voice changed. He no longer asked for opinions. He imposed orders. One of the oldest partners tried to warn him about accounting inconsistencies. Ethan smiled and replied coldly, "Anyone who doubts me is not part of the future." Days later, the man resigned. The company's expenses increased without explanation. Luxury cars, parties, political donations. The press praised the young tycoon's generous image. But behind the golden curtains, each check issued hid a bigger hole in the finances. Greed now had a fixed address. Jacob began piecing together the puzzle. He sifted through old contracts, spoke with former employees, and each answer led him deeper into the shadows. What he discovered left him speechless. Ethan had used his old patent, without authorization, to secure multi-million-dollar loans. The fury came calmly, almost coldly. Jacob knew that confronting his son-in-law openly would be useless. So he waited. He observed. Time would be the judge. And while the empire shone in parties and headlines, the invisible crack grew in the foundation of false gold that supported everything. Olivia tried to save her marriage with small gestures. She prepared dinner, left affectionate notes, but Ethan rarely read them. Money occupied all the space that had once been love. The sound of her cell phone vibrating replaced her laughter. The empire was expensive, and the price was human. At gala events, Ethan spoke of ethics and success. The cameras adored him. The investors idolized him. But when the lights went out, the truth whispered between glasses and contracts. He had forgotten who he was, and fate does not forgive those who mock their origins. Jacob, sitting in the old pickup truck, gazed at the orange Texas horizon and muttered to himself, "Pride doesn't last when the ground is weary." The wind blew dust onto his hands, the same hands that had once raised that name. He knew his son-in-law's laughter would still return as an echo. It was the early hours of the morning when Jacob received an anonymous call. A hoarse voice said only, "Check Ethan's safe." Then, silence. The old man didn't sleep anymore. Something inside him told him that what was hidden there could destroy not only his son-in-law, but the whole family. Days later, a storm hit Houston. Ethan traveled to Miami to close a deal, and Jacob took advantage of the empty house. Olivia, suspicious, gave him a spare key. "If something happens to me, you need to know what he did," she said, her eyes welling up with tears. The mansion seemed to breathe mysteries. Jacob walked through the corridors, listening to the distant sound of rain hitting the stained glass windows. The safe was in the office, a steel door with a digital keypad. He typed in his daughter's wedding date. The sound clicket echoed like a secret being betrayed. Inside there were black folders, contracts, and a gold flash drive. On top, an envelope with the name Harris Patent. Jacob's hands trembled. It was his patent, the document that guaranteed rights to a clean extraction technology he had created years before. Ethan had stolen it all, On the flash drive were the records of an illegal merger with foreign investors. Ethan was using his father-in-law's patent as collateral for a billion-dollar deal with a shell company. Each signature was a stab in the back disguised as a golden seal. Jacob felt his blood run cold. He printed copies and kept them in a brown folder. He knew his son-in-law would deny everything and that without solid proof, he would just be a bitter old man accusing his daughter's husband. He needed to act calmly. Time, once again, would be his silent ally. Olivia entered the office and found him motionless, staring at the papers. "I trusted him, Dad." Jacob placed his hand on hers and replied, "Blind love is greed's favorite disguise." She wept silently, feeling that this marriage was now a prison without bars. Meanwhile, in Miami, Ethan toasted in a luxurious hotel with his foreign partners. The contract was signed over champagne glasses and false promises. "To wealth and freedom," one of them said. Ethan smiled, unaware that he had just sealed his own fate. Back in Houston, Jacob sought out an old, trusted lawyer friend. He showed him the documents and asked for absolute secrecy. The man flipped through the pages with a frown. "If this gets exposed, he loses everything, and you get your honor back." Jacob simply replied, "I don't want victory, I want justice." The following days were a silent war. Ethan began to notice strange glances in the office, murmurs among the employees. Someone new, and fear, disguised as arrogance, began to show between the lines of his smile. The mask no longer fit properly. One night, arriving home, he found the safe open. Everything was in its place, except for the flash drive. Ethan stopped, his heart racing. For the first time, he felt the weight of control slipping away. Outside, thunder ripped through the sky, as if destiny itself were announcing what was to come. Jacob, on the other side of town, kept the flash drive inside a wooden box. On top, the pocket watch that Ethan had once mocked. He closed the lid slowly and whispered, "Time always exacts interest." Revenge was written, but redemption still awaited the right moment. Jacob returned to his routine as if nothing had happened. He visited his old office, greeted the employees, and smiled calmly. Behind that facade, a plan was being meticulously drawn up. He knew that his son-in-law's haste would be his own trap. While Ethan was planning a new expansion, Jacob was sending copies of the contracts to an investigative journalist from Houston Chronicle. He didn't ask for immediate exposure. He asked for time. "When everything seems perfect, publish it." The woman understood the tone. There was a story worth more than gold. Olivia noticed subtle changes. Her husband arrived earlier, more tense, suspicious of everyone. He locked his cell phone, reviewed security cameras, searched through documents. "Is there something wrong with me, Olivia?" She looked away, knowing the answer was yes, but not for the reason he thought. Jacob began discreetly attending corporate events where Ethan was a regular presence. He observed from afar, like a ghost amidst champagne glasses and artificial laughter. Every gesture from his son-in-law confirmed it. The boy who once sought advice now lived surrounded by lies. On a cloudy afternoon, Jacob received an anonymous letter. Inside, a photo. Ethan shaking hands with a politician accused of money laundering. On the back, just one sentence. "He doesn't work alone." The old man put the photo in his briefcase and smiled bitterly. The stage was set. Rumors began to circulate. Investors questioned the numbers. Auditors demanded explanations. Journalists made calls. Ethan tried to disguise his panic with rehearsed smiles, but the gleam in his eyes faded. For the first time, his fortune seemed heavier than his failure. On a quiet night, Jacob received a text message. "They're going to go broke before the end of the quarter." The sender was the journalist. The notification echoed like a seal of fate. He took a deep breath, glancing at his pocket watch. Time was about to settle the score. Ethan, alone in his office, gazed at the city through the glass wall. The reflection showed a man I no longer recognized. Outside, the lights of Houston flickered like distant memories of an empire beginning to crumble, and no one noticed that the ruin had already begun from within. Ethan realized something was out of control. The meetings became tense, the investors impatient. He called the chief accountant and demanded answers. The man hesitated. "The numbers don't add up, sir." Ethan fired him on the spot. "Loyalty is what sustains empires." But the tone of his voice no longer convinced anyone. That night, Ethan reviewed the contracts, searching for flaws. He found printed copies with Jacob's name in the margins. For a moment, his stomach churned. Did he know? He tried to ignore the doubt, but paranoia had already taken deep root. Olivia watched him from afar, with a mixture of pity and detachment. He still called it love, but she already saw something else: survival. "You don't trust anyone, Ethan." He replied without looking. "Trust is the luxury of those who have never lost anything." The sentence sounded like a farewell. Desperate to clear his name, Ethan called a secret meeting with his partners. He promised a plan to save them. However, what he presented was a grim proposal. Transfer part of the funds to anonymous accounts and blame a junior employee. No one needs to know. Silence was answer enough. One of the partners recorded the conversation. Loyalty had shifted sides. Jacob, at home, listened to the audio message and closed his eyes. It was the missing proof. His son-in-law's voice, firm and cold, confessing his own ruin. "Never underestimate the power of those who wait silently," he murmured. Ethan began to act out of desperation. He called politicians, tried to buy their silence, promised fake contracts. Every call left a trace. The pride that had made him laugh at his father-in-law now made him beg for help. His fortune was slipping through his fingers like sand. Olivia, no longer able to bear the weight of the lie, decided to confront him. "You destroyed everything my father built," Ethan shouted. "I made his name great." She replied coldly, "No, you just sold it for more." The sound of the door slamming shut echoed like a sentence. Jacob welcomed Olivia into his home. She carried the final piece of evidence, a folder signed by Ethan containing proof of illegal transfers. "He trusted the wrong lawyer," she said. Jacob opened the document and smiled sadly. "Sometimes God uses the pride of men to right justice." Meanwhile, Ethan planned to disappear. He sold stocks, prepared fake passports, emptied safe deposit boxes. But before leaving, he arranged one last meeting with Olivia. He wanted to justify himself, perhaps redeem himself. "I did everything for us." She simply replied, "You did everything for yourself." The following morning, the news broke in the newspapers. Coal Energy investigated for international fraud and corruption. The photos showed Ethan leaving the building amidst flashes and boos. The man who smiled on magazine covers was now avoiding cameras. The downfall began in public. Jacob watched on television, in silence. There was no joy in seeing him like this, only a bitter emptiness. "Time has taught us," he murmured, looking at the old clock. Olivia was crying, and he simply hugged her. "Love can still bloom after the ashes, my daughter. Pride never." That night, Ethan was alone on the rooftop. The wind rattled the windows, the champagne still open on the table. He looked in the mirror and didn't recognize the man before him. The laugh that had once mocked his father-in-law returned, but this time weak, broken. It was the sound of defeat. The newspapers tried to contact him, but Ethan didn't answer. He ordered his aides to prepare a lavish dinner for investors and politicians, a final act of control. The mansion was lit like a palace, glasses were set, and soft music played. Everything was perfect on the outside. Jacob and Olivia arrived together. No one knew they had the complete dossier in their possession. The old man was wearing the same brown suit, now impeccably pressed. His presence caused a slight, uncomfortable silence. Ethan forced a smile. "Dad, what a pleasant surprise." The guests toasted, but the atmosphere was strange. The tension seemed like an invisible perfume. Jacob observed every gesture, every rehearsed laugh. The man he once called his son-in-law now behaved like an actor trying to remember his lines. It was the final act of a collapsing empire. During dinner, an aide approached Ethan and whispered something in his ear. His face paled. A notification had arrived. The Houston Chronicle. He published the story. The secret was out in the streets. Cell phone screens began to glow like fire right there on the table. The guests, confused, began to whisper. Ethan stood up, trying to maintain his composure. "None of this is true," he said, his voice trembling. But the images in the newspaper showed otherwise. Fake contracts, illegal transfers, and his name on every page. Jacob remained seated, in absolute silence. When all eyes turned to him, he merely murmured, "The truth doesn't need a microphone. Just time." Ethan looked at his father-in-law and understood. The laughter had finally returned, but from a different face. Olivia left the table slowly. Guests' cameras captured her firm, serene expression. That woman who once believed in promises now walked free of burden. "He chose gold. I choose peace," she told a reporter as she exited through the main door. Ethan stood motionless, surrounded by flashes and questions. The noise of voices mingled with the sound of champagne spilling on the floor. He tried to justify himself, but no one listened. The empire still stood, but respect, that had completely crumbled. The news spread like wildfire. Within hours, all of Houston was buzzing about Ethan Cole's downfall. TV channels showed images from the dinner. Headlines flashed across screens, and the name, Cole Energy, it was becoming synonymous with fraud. The oil king was now a public joke. The following morning, reporters surrounded the mansion. Drones flew over the gates, capturing every movement. Ethan, exhausted, watched everything from the window. He tried to call his lawyers, but the lines were busy. The silence around him was more deafening than the questions shouting from outside. Jacob, at home, watched the coverage alongside Olivia. Neither of them spoke for minutes. When the reporter announced the opening of a federal investigation, he merely murmured, "The truth isn't quick, but it's accurate." Olivia held his hand. For the first time, there was peace in that gesture. In the office, Ethan tore up papers, dropped folders, and shouted orders to a team that no longer existed. The screens showed the stock plummeting. In minutes, 15 million had evaporated. The sound of shattering glass when he threw a cup against the wall sounded like the soundtrack to his own downfall. Outside, former employees waited. Some cried, others smiled. One whispered, he thought he could buy everything. A camera click captured the moment. Ethan leaving with a dejected face amidst flashes and microphones. That click would be immortalized on newspaper covers. When Jacob was called to testify, he arrived in his pickup truck, as always. No expensive suit, no speech, just his usual serene gaze. "Do you confirm that your son-in-law used your patent?" He calmly replied, "I confirm, and I also confirm that pride is more expensive than oil." In court, the judge's words echoed coldly. "Ethan Cole, the court finds you guilty of fraud and forgery." The man lowered his head. The same man who used to laugh at everyone now heard muffled laughter. Justice, when it arrives, rarely needs to shout. Olivia, sitting in the last row, wept silently, not out of pity, but out of liberation. Jacob placed his hand on her shoulder. "Some marriages end at the altar, others in court." She smiled sadly. Pain mingled with relief. The end had finally taken shape. As he was being escorted away, Ethan turned and looked at his father-in-law. Their eyes met. For a second, there was no hatred, only recognition. Jacob nodded lightly, as if forgiving without needing words. "Behind every fortune there is a shadow," the narrator whispered. Outside the courthouse, the Texas sun shone brightly. Reporters surrounded Jacob, asking if he felt vindicated. He replied, "No, just complete." And he walked away slowly, leaving behind the metallic sound of handcuffs and the weight of a closed chapter. The company was dissolved within weeks. The assets were auctioned off. The name Cole disappeared from buildings, headlines, and conversations. Only a distant echo remained, the laughter of a man who believed himself to be greater than his own roots. In a final scene, Jacob returned to the oil field where it all began. The wind blew hot, and the sound of the old machinery seemed like a prayer. He placed his pocket watch on the ground and said, "Now, time can rest." Behind him, the golden horizon opened in silence. Months have passed since the trial. The empire that once gleamed in gold now lay dormant in forgotten archives. Ethan was sentenced to 3 years of house arrest. The glass roof became a silent cell, where the only sound was the ticking of the clock marking the time he wasted. Without friends, without a wife, without fortune, he began to walk through the rooms like a stranger in his own life. Each picture on the wall seemed to mock who he had been. At night he looked at his reflection in the windows and saw not a businessman, but a small man, surrounded by his own walls. Jacob never visited him, not out of resentment, but because he had learned that some lessons require distance. Still, every month he discreetly sent a letter. There was never any judgment in the words, just one sentence. "Time can still teach you what money couldn't." Olivia started over little by little. She sold her old house, opened a small foundation to help indebted families. She told the press that she preferred to build lives, not empires. In every interview, her voice was firm, like someone who had traded the weight of gold for the lightness of peace. Ethan tried to answer the letters, but the words were stuck. Silence became his penance. He sat on the porch, gazing at the horizon that no longer applauded him. For the first time, he understood that true prison has no bars, only regret. Jacob, on the other hand, seemed rejuvenated. He returned to tending the small oil field he had maintained out of love for the trade. He worked slowly, listening to the sound of the wind among the machines. "The earth forgives those who respect it," he would say to the young workers who called him Mr. Harris. One morning he received an envelope. Inside, a short note. "Thank you for not giving up on me." Signed, Ethan. Jacob smiled, placed the paper inside his pocket watch and murmured, "Time has listened." The past, at last, had rested. At dusk, Jacob walked to the field fence and watched the sun set over Houston. The same brilliance that once fueled greed now illuminated serenity. He took a deep breath and said, "When gold rusts, only character shines." The wind carried his words like a prayer. Time passed, and Houston kept spinning, indifferent to the human ruins it left behind. But for Jacob, each sunrise brought a silent reminder: true wealth lies not in the hands, but in the heart that knows when to stop digging. He had lost a son-in-law and gained wisdom. Ethan, in his gilded isolation, watched the news in silence. He saw new entrepreneurs emerge, repeating the same mistakes he once called strategy. A bitter smile formed on his lips. Power blinds, until the light of truth burns the eyes. It was late, but finally he saw. Jacob put his watch back in his pocket, gazed at the horizon, and murmured, "Behind every fortune, there is a choice." The warm Texas breeze responded with a soft whisper, as if the earth recognized the end of the story. The old man walked slowly, letting the past rest in the desert dust. And so the cycle closed. Laughter turned to echo, arrogance to lesson, and silence to justice. Life doesn't give back what pride takes away, but it teaches you to walk lightly when the weight falls. In the end, time was the only judge that didn't sell itself to anyone. If this story touched you, remember, when money tests love, which side truly wins? Sign up for Hidden Fortunes to uncover the hidden truths behind each empire. Because sometimes what seems like victory is just the beginning of the fall.